Fozia Bora, speaking to us about on the topic of who wrote Islamic history books and why, reflections on the role of historiography in shaping identity and negotiating difference in pre-modern Muslim communities. Dr. Bora is an expert in this topic. She's an associate professor of Islamic history at the University of Leeds. She's been the Islam consultant for the Oxford English Dictionary, 3rd edition, and contributor to the Encyclopedia of Islam. And she serves as a council member for the British Association of Islamic Studies. It's great to have you here, Fozia. Without further ado, welcome. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Thank you so much, Mutnad. It's a real pleasure to join you. We've been trying for some time to get this together, so it's really nice to be here and really nice to be connecting with your audience. So the topic of my talk today is a series of reflections on why history writing became such a popular and important way for Muslims to express themselves in Arabic in the kind of early and medieval periods of Islam. And I want to sort of give you some broad outlines as to why history writing happened, who did the work, what kind of books we have as a result of that activity, and then to focus a bit more on what historiography or history as a kind of a series of books and works, a genre, if you like.
But counter to that, you have the fact that the Arabs were extremely skilled in oral transmission. So even from the days before Islam, Arabs would learn their genealogies, the family histories that they had for many generations. They would memorize them in a word perfect way. They would memorize reams and reams of poetry, again in a word perfect way. So their standards of oral transmission are extremely strong and powerful. And for us today, with our emphasis on written materials, it's kind of hard to imagine that tradition would be as strong as it was, but it was very strong. In fact, scholars today say that oral transmission was stronger than our written transmissions today. So that's a bit about the oral background. So within about 150 years of the passing away of the Prophet, peace be upon him, this early oral tradition started being written down. This is in the Abbasid era of Islamic history. When a Sunni caliphate was in power, they were extremely keen to write down all of Islamic thought, from law to the hadith corpus to theology, and they also were keen to see the writing down of history. So that's where you see the transition from the oral forms of history transmission to the written form. Now, I'm going to say a few words now about why this process of history recollection and writing has become problematic. This early material that I've just described to you from early eyewitness and participants is now quite fought over. It's fought over for various reasons. There's no kind of consensus on what this history means, the authenticity of it, and that's for several reasons. One is the problem I've already described to you, which is the transition from oral to written history. So we've already talked about that. It's kind of it's seen as unreliable because we're in the contemporary age obsessed with the written documents, and we also like to look at material evidence. So if we think about, for example, something that happened 500 years ago, we like to see written sources, but that should be backed up with evidence from, for example, archaeology, evidence from buildings, from coins, from costumes, from physical evidence that we can find. So our understanding of what constitutes reliable history is very different from what was considered reliable in the early Islamic period. So that's one immediate problem we have when we think about early Islamic history. Another problem we have is that when the historians first began to commit these traditions to paper, they were writing in the Abbasid era that I've just described to you, which was from 750 to around 1250. And in this Abbasid era, I mean, the Abbasid era actually goes on for a very long time, but that's the kind of the Abbasid era proper, when the Abbasids actually have some kind of hold on power. In that time, the Abbasids, the caliphs, they were sponsoring the writing of history by historians whom they trusted to do this work. So there's a danger that the Abbasid era history is written from the perspective of the Abbasids. In other words, it has a bias. So you could say that's a Sunni bias. It's a bias to do with their region, to do with the fact that they are Qurayshi, etc., etc., etc. So it's not a straightforwardly neutral account of early Islamic history that you get in the Abbasid era historical sources. These sources include Tabari, whose book I've just sort of provided an image of the first page of here, and Baladhari, and I'll say more about them in a moment. So the Abbasid era biases are a second problem that we have with early Islamic history tradition. And then a final problem I want to mention to you is the fact that in the modern age, when we study Islamic history, particularly in academic settings, you have the issue of Orientalism. Orientalism meaning Western academics, historians, researchers who look at the Islamic world through a hyper-skeptical lens. In other words, they come with the assumption that Islamic sources are biased, are subjective, and are not to be trusted. So that's a third problem that we have when we think about the early Islamic historical tradition, that academia has taken on board some of this Orientalist thinking. Now, happily, with a lot more Muslims being involved in history, Muslims of all backgrounds, being involved in academia, being involved in research, you see Orientalism is being kind of sort of countered and resisted and in many ways kind of abandoned. Many of you may have heard of Edward Said's excellent book, Orientalism. That was a game changer for the field of Islamic history. So the early Islamic history was written down something like 150 years after the events took place, up to 150 years after the events took place. And it has been kind of, the subject of a lot of kind of academic activity in trying to work out what's reliable about this material or not. Okay, so that's a bit about who wrote the history books. Bear in mind that they're not books in the early era, they're just narrations, and they become books within the Abbasid era. Okay, so next I want to talk about why write history. What's the value of writing down history? The obvious answer is to remember what happened, but why in particular did Arab historians place so much emphasis on the importance of history? Well, in the initial kind of Islamic period, there was a kind of very profound connection between understanding the Quran, the asbab al-nuzul, the kind of context in which particular verses were revealed. There was a very great interest in the hadith and the context in which they were narrated, and a great emphasis on knowing the life story of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So all of those interests lended themselves to the writing down of Islamic history. As well as those themes, Islamic historians were also interested in how conquest occurred. So within 30 years of the passing away of the Prophet, peace be upon him, vast regions of what we now think of as the Middle East were conquered by Islamic armies, sometimes by force, sometimes by peaceful treaty. And that process of Islam spreading so quickly from the Hijaz into the Mediterranean region and beyond was a story that early Islamic historians were very keen to tell. And as well as talking about conquest and talking about religious scripture, the historians were also trying to affirm religious identity. In other words, to justify why Islam had spread and kind of confirming that the Islamic message was worth spreading to all these regions. So those are kind of some of the initial reasons for writing history. But what's very interesting, if you look at some of the work of the early historians, the historians who began to, kind of commit the oral tradition to paper, two people who stand out in this process are Tabari, who died in 923 of the Common Era, and Baladhari, who died a few decades before that. And they are interesting because they write history books in many, many volumes. So Tabari has Ta'rikh al-Rusul wal-Muluk, and Baladhari has a book of the Islamic conquests, the Ansab al-Ashraf and various other books. So these historians write books in many, many volumes with a lot of detail. But what's interesting about them is they don't just write their own perspective. They put into their books testimonies, accounts, stories from many, many different sources. So each book is like a patchwork quilt of traditions which come from many sources, often from participants, from eyewitnesses, from people who spoke to eyewitnesses, and so on. And interestingly, they often give you contradictory accounts. So, for example, with the early civil wars, which surrounding the succession to the Prophet, peace be upon him, and so on, Tabari will give you different accounts. He will say, so one group of companions had this perspective, another group of companions had this perspective. And he doesn't say necessarily which he thinks is the right one. Often he will say, God knows best, and he's leaving it to the reader to decide which is the most authentic account. So Tabari, as some of you may know, is a Sunni historian, but he often includes pro-Ali or Shi'i material. I'm using, of course, terminology that was not used at that time, but that's what we would understand to be pro-Ali or Shi'i material. And he refers to the Deen of Ali or the Creed of Ali, which is an interesting kind of set of themes in his book which are surrounding the claim of Sayyidina Ali to succeeding the Prophet, peace be upon him, and he includes those claims. So what we have is a pluralistic model of history writing. In other words, it's not simply imposing a view on the reader, but rather inviting the reader to negotiate between various accounts of early Islamic history, knowing as they do that these events are extremely important for believers, that they will be invested in a particular reading of history, and they want to make sure that they have access to as much material as Tabari can provide. Okay, so yeah. Now that's in the early period, around 1000 CE. After this, you see history taking on a different kind of character. Later historians of the Fatimid, Ayyubid, and Mamluk eras, so these are dynasties that centered in Egypt and Syria, particularly Egypt and North Africa for the Fatimids, but also Egypt and Syria for the Ayyubids and the Mamluks. The Fatimids, as you may know, are an Ismaili dynasty. The Ayyubids and the Mamluks are Sunni dynasties. And in their times, historians were doing something different. They weren't simply writing about religion. They weren't simply talking about the seerah, the conquest, and so on, but rather they were using history as a way to talk about their own societies. And in their books, they are much more critical of the people who ruled over them. They're much more critical of their fellow ulama and intellectuals, and they're critical of society when they see corruption setting in. So I'll say more about that later. But I just wanted to point out here that history writing begins with a very religious flavor, but later on it becomes a much more a means of socio-political commentary on the times people were living in. So that's kind of the genesis of history writing over the first few centuries of Islamic history. So this is a map of the Fatimid Caliphate. The Fatimids call themselves both Imams and Caliphs. They had a rival caliphate to the Abbasid Sunnis of the East. So their empire, it began in modern day Tunisia in a place called Qayrawan, and then they moved eventually to Egypt, and they conquered Egypt in 969 of the Common Era, and they based themselves in Cairo as the seat of their new empire and their caliphate. They did move into, by conquest, into the Hijaz and into Syria at various points. So what this map shows you is at where they are at the height of their power, and then eventually they did lose their territories in the Hijaz and in Syria. But this is the extent of their empire. Now, I'm mentioning the Fatimids in particular because some of my research has focused on how Sunni historians looked back at the Ismaili Shi'i past. And what I found was interesting, and actually quite sort of surprising in a way, was that Sunni historians did not look at the Fatimids with a particularly hostile view necessarily. Some of them did say, well, they are heretics. They don't have a true claim to being caliphs or imams. But there were also many historians, including one historian in particular that I've worked on in my research, who actually gave them their due. He's a Sunni historian, but he was happy to regard the Fatimids as caliphs and as imams, and he gives them a very balanced portrayal in his book, something I'll come to shortly. So moving on now to the history books produced by the historians of the kind I've mentioned. So in the earliest forms of writing from Tabari onwards and into the 15th century, in all of those centuries, history books were written in manuscript form. In other words, they were handwritten on paper, which were then bound into books. The Islamic world didn't embrace the printing press, until quite late. This is partly because the Ottomans were quite suspicious of the printing press, what it would mean from a religious perspective, but also from a social perspective, a political perspective. They were nervous about it, and their ulama had fatwas against the printing press for some centuries. But eventually, printing presses were embraced. But before that time, So for all of the eras I'm talking about, the writing of history was in manuscript form. So a historian would write a book, usually multiple volumes, and this would then be copied by hand by scribes. And the kind of scribal culture or the writerly culture was extremely vibrant. Books were really valuable, the equivalent of thousands of pounds in our money, and they were often illuminated in gold leaf, and they would have expensive inks added to them if they were sufficiently kind of well kind of patronized or well funded by royal or other rich patrons. So there's a really vibrant scribal culture in which books were produced and copied and then passed around. They were passed around from person to person through people borrowing books from personal libraries. There were also state-owned libraries. The Fatimids had a Dar al-Hikmah, a house of learning, in which people were able to come and copy books, and they would provide paper and pens for people to be able to do that. So there was a great interest in learning about history and other subjects, and in using libraries as a way to secure access to these written materials. A word now about paper. It's important to kind of keep in mind that this writerly culture that I've just described to you, it relied on paper being available, but paper was still relatively scarce in the sense that it was very expensive. There had been paper being made in the Islamic world from the 9th century when it went from Syria to Egypt. Paper-making techniques had first been learnt by the Arabs from the Chinese in the very early Islamic period, but it only became popular sometime later. But even in the 15th century, paper is extremely expensive. So what historians and other writers would do is they would write notes on paper already used for some other purpose. So I have here an example of this. So this is from the library of a scholar in Damascus called Abdul Hadi. And Abdul Hadi, he had various documents, including a marriage contract, and he reused that paper written on which the contract was written to write his notes for other work. So this is one example. He left a whole library of materials like this, but this is one example. And here you see that the larger writing is from the contract, and contracts would often use paper quite wastefully, so leave lots of gaps between them and have blank pages. And a resourceful scholar like Abdul Hadi would reuse this paper by using the gaps between this large script to write other material. So that's an example of paper reuse, which was very common in the medieval Islamic period. We also know that historians wanted to make their books, their history books, as user-friendly as possible. So they would have a series of archival features. Archive meaning a kind of a treasury of written materials, which users should be able to follow with ease and comfort. So some of the features you see in the books of history of the medieval period, you see that historians will use chapter headings. So they'll break down the narrative so that you understand what each section is about, much like we have chapter headings today. They also had a very useful habit of telling us which sources their information came from. So they would cite from earlier books or from historians of the past or even of the present, and they would acknowledge that they were using the work of other people. So they quoted accurately and widely, but with full acknowledgement in many cases. Not every historian writes in this way, but the one I'm going to talk to you about today, Ibn al-Farad, he's very, very careful to acknowledge every source that feeds into his own book, which is great for us because then we see where his information comes from. So they also used a technique of using red ink to mark the chapter headings, to mark where a source is being cited, and that's called rubrication. So I have here an example of rubrication. So you see this is Ibn al-Farad. I'll come to him in a minute, but this is his book of history. This is his own handwriting. It's a very exciting manuscript because it's the only one that exists of his book in the whole world. There's no other copies of it. And this his book of history, he uses red ink to tell us the section title. He uses red ink to tell us about the source he's citing, and also certain verbs. So it kind of breaks up the narrative. So thumma, wa shara'a, and walamma, wa kana. So these kind of verbs, he's using them. He's marking them with red ink so that it breaks up the narrative and makes it more user friendly. You can also see he's got glosses in the margin where he's adding notes to his material, where he's kind of fleshing out the narrative, putting in something he's forgotten, and so on. This is very common to add marginal notes to history books. Historians would also put their, so they would often include, as well as stories of the past, they would have obituaries. So they would acknowledge the achievements of people who died. And in those obituaries, they would praise the person who passed away, and then mention who they'd left behind and the legacy and so on. But they would put these obituaries into alphabetical order. And this again was a way to help the reader to navigate between this material. And another feature I want to mention to you is, so here we have rubrication, red ink. Here we have space left for obituaries. So this is Ibn al-Farad's book. He's left space here to add obituaries as he comes to know of the deaths of further people. And here I want to tell you about a technique called istikhraj or ta'qiba, where you have at the bottom of one page, the historian or writer will write down the first word of the next page. And the reason for doing this is because before they were bound, these books were loose papers, loose leaves, and the writer wanted to absolutely make sure that they got the order correct. So instead of using numbering the way we would today, they would use this technique where you write down the first word of the next page to make sure you get the order correct. So again, this is sort of an archival technique to make sure everything flows smoothly and properly and is easy for the reader to follow. So these are some of the techniques that historians used, and I've taken all these examples from the work of a particular author. This particular author is called Ibn al-Farad. He's a hadith scholar and a historian who lives in Mamluk, Egypt. He works in a madrasa, and he dies in 1405. He has a book which he's left behind called Tarikh ad-Duwal wal Muluk, History of Dynasties and Kings. And this is the book I mentioned before, which we only have surviving in one single copy, which is now held, most of the volumes are now held in the National Library of Vienna. Like many Arabic manuscripts, valuable ones, it's not in the place where it was produced, but has traveled. Many Arabic manuscripts have traveled to Istanbul, to European libraries in the States, libraries elsewhere. So it's rare to find books, manuscripts still remaining in the places in which they were produced. And this is because of the very lively manuscript trade that's been around for many centuries. But that's another story. So we have Ibn al-Farad's book today held in the National Library of Vienna, and that's where all these examples are taken from. It's particularly nice to see the historian's own handwriting and not sort of a copy made by somebody else, which is often you see a copy made by somebody else, but this makes it more kind of resonant to work with. So this brings me to the question of what are historians interested in? How do they categorize people? What kinds of stories do they tell about people? Now we're kind of moving on now away from the very early period when we see historians talking mainly about the Sira or the early civil wars or the conquest, but rather what happens in the later period when Islamic civilization is more settled. So in that period, so from the 1000s, 1100s, 1200s onwards, you see that historians are interested in people for a variety of reasons. They classify people a lot, really, through history books and through a genre called biographical dictionaries. Some of you may be familiar with these. Biographical dictionaries are books in which a whole category of people are described and their lives kind of commemorated. It could be the history of a city, so all of the people who live in a particular city. So, for example, a city like Aleppo, one historian might write a history of Aleppo in a particular century or several centuries. So, historians can be interested in the places where people lived. They often are interested in professions. So, there's a book on the medical doctors of Upper Egypt. So, that book looks at all of the doctors that were known in the medieval period in a particular region. You have books that focus on, for example, women. Women often are mentioned in biographical dictionaries in particular sections, or you also see women kind of interspersed through a more general narrative, so it can take both forms. And then you also see people categorized according to their madhab or religious rites, and also their Sufi tariqah. So people are categorized in all kinds of ways in history books, and historians are interested in people through all of these categories. I've included here an image of women attending the teaching of Sheikh Bahauddin in Afghanistan around 1600, and this kind of I've included this image to show that women were also interested and involved in the transmission of learning. And here you see that the women are sitting in a gallery where they're out of view of the men, but they can see everything that's going on and hear the teacher teaching. Okay, so here I have next an example of a biographical dictionary. This one is focused on Sufi women, and the author was an 11th century author, Abdurrahman as-Sulami. So he is, Sulami is writing about all of the Sufi women of a particular century. So that's an example of a biographical dictionary. Now, if we go on now, I've talked a little bit about what historians were interested in and kind of identity, but what they're also able to do in books of history is to think about how different people negotiated their differences. And one important example of this, sorry, let me just go back, is on the question of the religious difference. So in my recent research, I've looked at how Sunni authors look back at an Ismaili Shi'i past. And one thing that I've found to be quite important to draw out in these books of history, in particular Ibn al-Farad's book of history, is that he doesn't really look primarily at the religious background of the people he talks about. He mentions their religious background, but he isn't judging them on that basis. So when he writes about the Fatimids, for example, he gives them a very fair hearing. He talks about them as the dynasty that built up the city of Cairo. They put Egypt on the world map by building a huge empire. They were great sponsors of learning. They built magnificent libraries. They were extremely resourceful in extending their empire. And he basically gives them the same treatment that he would give to any Sunni dynasty of the same period. So this, I think, is quite revealing because it shows that the historians are not necessarily writing history through what we would call a sectarian lens, which I found to be, quite refreshing. Ibn al-Farad is particularly fond of citing Imami 12 Shi'i sources. He cites them liberally. He's particularly fond of an Aleppan historian called Ibn Abi Tayy, and he uses his book with great reverence. He gives Ibn Abi Tayy his full title, Taj al-Riyasa, and Sheikh Ibn Abi Tayy, and gives him a lot of kind of respect. And he tells stories that Ibn Abi Tayy mentions, stories relating to the grandchildren and successors of the Prophet. In other words, the kind of the Alid family. Again, he reproduces these with great reverence. On the other hand, he's very critical of his own Sunni Mamluk rulers and fellow Sunni ulama for their corruption, for the way they mishandle a crisis. So in the Mamluk period, you had crises to do with famines, crises to do with the Black Death or the plague. You had crises that were financial, resulting from all kinds of problems, whether it's to do with the Mongol invasion or the Crusades and so on. So in these ups and downs of history, Ibn al-Furat is very clear when he thinks a Mamluk ruler has behaved well or when he thinks they've behaved badly. And he doesn't feel any reservation about criticizing the sultans and so on, and even ulama when he feels they behave badly. So in that sense, you see that they have what we would think of as a certain amount of intellectual freedom. And he shows us that history writing in this era isn't necessarily about pushing an agenda, but rather it's a way to negotiate difference. Now, I mentioned previously the biographical dictionaries where you have historians interested in the history of a particular city, the history of a profession, the history of a region, and so on. And the biographical dictionaries do have that kind of bias where they're focusing on a particular strand of people. And in that sense, they do have a narrow focus in one sense. But chronicles are the kind of history books which look at history more broadly than a particular city or a particular group of people. Chronicles are much more open. You see a chronicle writer like Ibn al-Furat bringing in sources that are, non-Sunni. He even cites Christian sources, and historiography there is more a place for self-reflection and for critique, as well as celebration. We also see through Ibn al-Furat's history that history is forensic. He's really interested in getting as many sources as possible into his account to give you a good amount of evidence. I'll give you an example. Ibn al-Furat is able to include documents. He finds documents. He works in a madrasa, and he works in an era where there's a kind of a lively book market in the city where he is based. So he's able to buy decommissioned documents that were produced by the government, and he includes material like that in his book, and he uses early historians who had documents in their books. Documents meaning government decrees and so on. He also includes poetry, he includes letters, he includes the books of the Fatimid era itself, which are no longer survive to the present day. So he preserves for us a great deal of material which, if it weren't for his book, would have been lost through the mists of time. So he's really, really valuable from that perspective. Where Ibn al-Furat has multiple sources and they each tell a slightly different version of a particular story, he tells us that he may consider one or another to be more accurate, but he also says that and God knows best. So in other words, like somebody before him centuries before, he's also leaving it to the reader to negotiate between these different kinds of sources. And if there's one key takeaway from this talk I want to share with you, it's the idea that when you get to the later period of Islamic history writing is not about pushing any kind of agenda, but rather it's about knowing history and proving that the knowledge of history is important for its own sake and not simply for historians to please a caliph or please a patron, but rather you do get history where historians are pleasing patrons or pleasing caliphs, but there's also a very strong strand of history where historians are independent, they have their own income from working in a madrasa or other kinds of work, and they are absolutely clear that where the ulama or the caliphs or the sultans misbehave, they will be the ones to share that with their readers. Okay, I think I'll stop there. Is that okay?
Thank you very much for that, for the talk, and thank you for sharing your insights. If anyone does have a question, please do feel free to either ask it on the YouTube chat or on the chat here on Zoom, or feel free to let me know that you would like to ask a question on YouTube, Zoom, or just message me on WhatsApp. The first question that's come through is, as you may be aware, we have a large library space allocated within the Salam Center, the building that they're hoping to construct on our current site. If you were given a clean slate, how would you furnish and equip this library? Please share your thoughts on what should such a library offer in the context of it being housed within a Muslim center, but yet open to the wider public.
Wow. Well, can I just say how lucky you are to have this lovely blank slate of a library space? And it's a great question. So obviously, being someone who researches on history, I probably have a big bias towards historical materials. But having said that, history writing and the study of history writing has become really broad these days. So you have people who work on early Islamic inscriptions on rocks. Found in the Arabian Peninsula and in southern Jordan. You have people working on books of maps. You have people working on coinage. You have people working on embroidery, on clothing. You have people working on all kinds of different forms of historical material. So if I had a blank slate, I would definitely put a lot of history in there. And the reason for that is because I think knowing your history allows you to understand your own identity. A bit like the historians I talked about in the early period who are using history to build a sense of identity. And so in that kind of project of trying to see how history can help you build identity, I would probably include primary sources, so books like the history of Tabari, books like Ibn al-Furat. Now, obviously, unless you're very rich, you probably can't afford the manuscripts, but you can afford the modern editions of these books. And so if you can find some of those primary sources, that's fantastic. And then I would put in there modern studies. So there are many kind of modern academic researchers who are producing books on these topics. Which explain the primary sources, explain the context in which they were written, and explain how we can benefit from them today. So yeah, I mean, I think history should play a really decent role in the furnishing of your library, and I think that would be a way also for your non-Muslim participants or library users and visitors to get a sense of the vibrancy of Muslim culture, because obviously history books are a window onto Islamic culture, and I think a really surprising one in many ways. So that would be my slightly biased answer to that question.
Assalamu alaikum.
Islam.
Thank you very much for your very thought-provoking talk. I was wondering if in this you found any sort of conflicts between the Umayyad and Fatimid narratives of just the recent past history in North Africa and Andalusia, because obviously other parts there was a little bit more distance and tolerance, but here there was the Umayyads were keen to push a particular narrative, and the Fatimids were keen to correct that. So I don't know if you have found.
Yeah. So one of the problems we have, and Jazakallah, that's a really great question. One of the problems we have at the moment in our current state of knowledge is that there's a real sense that the Fatimids' books of history were not plentiful to begin with, and they haven't really survived in numbers to the present day. But what you do have is you have someone like Qadi al-Nu'man, a very important Fatimid thinker, who produced an account of how the Fatimids came to power. It's called the Iftitah al-Da'wah. And in that, he presents the religious claim of the Fatimids to rule over the Islamic world. So although there isn't a great deal in historiography of direct kind of headbutting of the Fatimids and the Umayyads, mainly because we don't have the Fatimid historical sources surviving to the present day, we do see some of that coming through in historians or thinkers who wrote their own accounts of why a particular dynasty, in this case the Fatimids, should be considered the real caliphs of Islam, and not the Umayyads of Spain or the Abbasids in the east. So you do see some kind of indirect kind of headbutting between them. In terms of kind of where you see where the role of historians is. Historians, if they were writing in a particular context, in the court of a ruler, or even in a particular country, they would of course absorb the biases of their time. They would frequently see outsiders as the enemy, particularly if they were in the middle of a conflict. And you see this particularly where the Crusades are concerned. You see historians of the kind of Fatimid Ayyubid Mamluk era describe the Crusaders in quite negative ways, but I see less of that directed at fellow Muslims, whether Sunni or Imami Shi'i or whatever. But that's not to say that they thought kindly of fellow Muslims necessarily. It's more that we don't have the source material to be able to draw out those conflicts on paper as much as we'd like to. So that's kind of the slightly unsatisfying answer to that question.
I'm sorry. Yes. One more question has come from YouTube. Did any independent historians get access to the caliphs and their palaces, or was it just not? Did they just never get access?
So it depends which caliph you mean and which palace and which era, because they were all different. In terms of the Fatimids, caliphs were extremely mysterious in the sense that it was part of their religious kind of aura to have a kind of mystique about them. So they would appear in public only with a veil over their faces. They would have a sunshade over them, kind of various people around them in a kind of entourage. And it was you could access the caliph if you had a grievance. So the caliph had a court for grievances, and you could definitely send through the particular channels that caliph had set out. You could get a message to the caliph saying that you need the caliph to dispense justice for a problem you had. But in terms of day-to-day meeting with the caliph, it was considered a very, very high privilege. So that didn't happen very often, and historians were the same as everybody else in that respect. Having said that, if you move forward to the Mamluk period, when the Sunni Mamluks were in power, these are sultans, not caliphs. They're military men who become the rulers, ruling in the name of the caliphs, and historians do have more access to them. They don't have the same aura or mystique about them, and historians often did meet with caliphs and would read their works to caliphs, but often they avoided seeing caliphs because they were opposed to the caliph's policies. And you see someone like Ibn Khaldun, who worked for the caliphs, often as a qadi, and he was more respectful of sultans. He was more respectful of the sultan's power. But then you have someone like Maqrizi, a few decades later, who worked in the state chancery, in the treasury, but he was extremely critical of the sultans, and he left the work of the government after a certain period, and that gave him more freedom to be able to write in the critical mode in which you see him writing. So it depended where you were and which city and which dynasty was in power.
Okay, thank you very much. Miqdad, I'm going to try and unmute you, or Amar, can you please unmute Miqdad? Yeah, please go ahead.
So I was wondering if you had a view on these kind of more modern historical dramas that we're seeing a lot of, like the Turkish ones like Ertugrul, and do you think that they're useful, interesting takes on Islamic history, or distractions from factual accounts?
I think they're not meant to be factual. I mean, the story of Ertugrul in particular, the basis, the historical basis of it is extremely flimsy, and I don't really see them as vehicles for history learning. Rather, I see them as a way for Muslims to kind of appreciate the richness of their cultural heritage without being particularly concerned about accuracy. So I don't really see them as an educational experience, but rather as a recreational experience to kind of allow yourself to sort of be submerged in I was going to say an imagined Muslim culture. I think the cultural aspects are probably more truthful, but in terms of what actually happened, it's very much a kind of taking a few facts that we do know about that period of kind of early Seljuk history and building something quite grandiose out of it. So I think one of the casualties of that kind of way of producing TV is that it's not really based on anything very, very reliable or solid in terms of the historical record. Having said that, I'm not against them. I think we all need ways to unwind, and I think they're well produced. I haven't watched many of them myself, just because, not because I'm against them, but because I don't have a lot of time for TV these days. But I can see why they're much loved. I think they bring something of the richness of Islamic culture and history to the lives of Muslims today. If I were to make something like that, I would try to combine that recreational kind of power and that joy of being immersed in Muslim culture with more historical accuracy. But I appreciate that that's not particularly easy to do. I mean, some series I think have been more concerned with historical accuracy, but on the whole, I think that's not their purpose. So, I think that they haven't gone to a great deal of trouble to try to use it as a vehicle for educating people about the history that actually happened.
Thank you very much. Migdad, if you have a follow-up, please let me know on the chat. Otherwise, Omar, would you like to ask directly? Omar, please can you unmute Omar?
Hello, assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
Thank you very much for this really quite enlightening window into the perspective of historians on their own work. I was interested in two elements really here. You mentioned the early tradition of identity formation, and then subsequently the use of history as a commentary upon current crises or current governance within later historical or amongst later historians.
Yeah.
And firstly, I wonder how many of these historians might have perhaps had, in brackets, a subaltern perspective. How many of these individuals could have come out from outside traditional ulama communities or official patronage? And associated with that, what would the career of a historian at this time look like? What in an environment which is characterized by scholarly independence, whether it is in fiqh or whether it is in amongst the historians that you've highlighted, how is that independence maintained? What are the independent structures they come through? Is it through the madrasas that are there and awqaf, or do they tend to have appointments in other specialties or other professions, and this becomes a side pursuit which consolidates into their study?
Yeah, thank you. What great questions. In terms of subaltern aspect, I've sort of tried to think about this with the work of Ibn al-Furat, because he's very resourceful and he looks very widely to build his narrative. It's actually very difficult to see history writing as having a truly subaltern dimension, because really this is the history of the literate communities of cities, not really the regions. And the activity of writing history falls mainly to ulama, and sometimes to the awlad an-nas, or the sons of Mamluks who had a formal education, but not really to people from more humble backgrounds. Having said this, the trajectories of ulama, as the biographical dictionaries tell us, could really vary. So if I give you an example of two people writing roughly the same time, you have Ibn Khaldun. He dies in 1406. He travels from one court to another court, whether in North Africa or whether in Umayyad Spain or whether in the Mamluk Egypt, and he associates himself with rulers. He courts the patronage of rulers, and he lives his life really in the highest circles of prestige and power. Now he has many ups and downs. He falls from grace just as he climbs to it, and he has a troubled life in many ways. So that's an example of a historian who rises to the top and stays at the top in a key sense. But then you have someone like Ibn Furat, who dies in 1405, so just the year before Ibn Khaldun, lives the whole of his life in Cairo Fustat. He never goes beyond the relatively mundane occupation of a notary witness in the state administration. He works in a madrasa as a muhaddith and preacher. He never makes much money. His book is never copied, which suggests that he didn't have money to pay a scribe. But this book is extraordinarily rich. So you see patterns within the kind of historian community, if you can call it that, which show differences of class, differences of status, and differences of wealth. Now, those are differences which exist within a particular class of people. They're still urban literate people. So they're not what you could call subaltern. The way in which we found subaltern perspectives is when we've seen non-historian sources. And one chief example is the Cairo Geniza, which is, as you may know, it's this treasure trove of writings and written materials produced actually by the Jewish communities of medieval Cairo. And in that you see quite a lot of Islamic material, but you also see quite a lot of letters, documents, and, if you like, the traces of ordinary life coming from the bottom upwards. So that's great. You don't see that kind of detail in books of history per se. So I would say there's a limited scope for subaltern perspectives in either biographical dictionaries or in the chronicles. But having said that, the caveat there is that we should not then assume that everybody comes from the same background or has the same sort of trajectory. We don't see many references to people who are extremely poor, except insofar as they are the recipients of charity, except where they are contributing to the life of a madrasa, as vendors of small items and so on, or working as people, in the madrasa, to clean the carpets or provide food, etc. So you only see passing references to these people. You don't actually hear their voices. The same is true of slaves. In general, the slaves who are domestic slaves, we don't hear from them in their own voices. What we do see is slaves, for example, slave women who become literate, who then write poetry, write songs, and you see them being cited at times. So it's a mixed picture. We don't really have any historians who are particularly concerned to write the history of the impoverished per se. So that's one thing to say. On the question of how ulama were able to maintain a certain intellectual independence, the madrasas played a huge role, obviously being founded on waqfs. The waqfs gave them were theoretically independent of political interference. So that provided huge scope for ulama to be paid and supported without needing the patronage of a scholar or a caliph or a sultan, or even other powerful people. That's not to say that some ulama didn't struggle. It's clear, that some ulama never really made it as kind of well cited people in their own time. And we know that because so many books are referred to in later works, but you don't see them extant in themselves. So there's a whole kind of substrate or layer of historical material which doesn't really survive. And part of the issue there is that the historians who wrote them were not well known or prestigious or wealthy enough to have their works copied multiple times and then passed around to the works of to inform the works of later historians. So there's a lot going on, but the madrasas are absolutely key in helping to maintain the independence of ulama in the at least in the Ayyub and Mamluk periods.
Thank you very much. We do have a couple more questions. Maybe I'll just ask them quickly. I think they're quite short ones, and then we'll probably have to close because it has been an hour, and you're probably getting tired. So the first question is, what does subaltern mean? That's probably referring to the previous question. And the final question is, why do you think most of Islamic history is written by Sunni writers?
Okay, so subaltern. So a subaltern is a kind of lower grade, lower ranking officer. and it usually means history coming from bottom upwards, so from the lower ranks of society, you know, kind of rather than coming from the top down. That's just a very, very simple answer to that, over simple in some ways. Now, I've mentioned Sunni historians, but I did mention that they cite Shi'i authors. So it's not that the historians were exclusively Sunni by any means. Rather, you see historians coming from different traditions. So I mentioned before Qadi al-Nu'man and his Iftidah al-Da'wah. So he's an Ismaili Shi'i historian. I mentioned Ibn Abi Tayh, who's an Imami 12 Shi'i historian. And you know, there are historians coming from various religious backgrounds. Now, one thing that is important to note is that the history of the Fatimids, who are Ismailis, they don't have a great many historical books coming from their era, from their court, from their intellectual circles. Rather, it's left to the Sunni historians to look back and describe their history. And there you see a mixed picture. You see people like Ibn al-Furat, who isn't particularly worried about them being Shi'i. He embraces them. He embraces their achievements. And then you have someone like Suyuti, who's fairly sectarian. He moans about them not being Sunni and about them being heretical. So you see a range of perspectives. But in general, I would say that it's not just Sunnis who wrote history. Rather, you see history coming from many different kinds of authors. I mean, the Sunnis predominate partly because of madrasa culture, because you're talking mostly about Sunni political power, and you know that colors the kind of work that's sponsored and patronized. But it's definitely more pluralistic than saying it's all Sunni.
Thank you very much. And I think we will have to end there. I know there'll probably be more questions and more interesting more interesting insights that you'd be able to provide, but we do have to end there because we've passed Maghrib time actually already. So thank you very much, Fozia, for giving us the opportunity to learn from you and to benefit from your insights and expertise. Just a quick reminder for everyone in terms of the next few lectures. We have Sheikh Nuru, who will be speaking on the Wiladat of the 8th Imam alayhi salam next week. The week after, we have Muhammad Shafiq, who will be talking to us about occupied Kashmir. The week after, Islam and Slavery by Professor Clarence Smith. And the week after, Modest Fashion, Commerce, Community and Controversy by Professor Rainer Lewis. We look forward to seeing you on Zoom and or on YouTube next week and the weeks coming up. So thank you very much, and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Thank you very much. Take care. Ma salam.